We regretted it. We deeply regretted it. This aging clunker was all we could afford, and we were warned repeatedly that it would have been better if it were scrapped. But we ignored it. But, for a fledgling cargo company made out of last-minute desperation, it was all we could scrape together. Granted, the clunker had served us dutifully for the last 2 years, and had almost universally ignored our careful nurture. So here we were, trapped in a dry dock on a backwater star system. Engine and main drive refusing to start up, computer systems and navigation trying to send us into the ass end of nowhere. Any tool we try to use either makes it worse or does nothing. Any attempt to fix any of the ship's programming simply results in any changes reverting within hours. We had given up. At this point, we were simply waiting for the harbor master to fine us and have the ship scrapped, giving us a loss on the cargo we carried as a write-off, and then soak our heads in the bar. I, along with 7 of my 8 crewmates, sat in solemn contemplation on the ship's bridge, listening to the angry beeping coming from the Navicomp screen. I looked at my fellows, outcasts, castaways, rebels, and forgotten. I was the captain. My pack had cast me out after I reached a certain age and drifted out into the cosmos, finding these guys rotting in a backwater club. Jess had lost a fight with a Tarian, missing 2 of the fingers on his left paw. Ray and Rad were brothers, having run away from home only to get caught in gang warfare. Laura and Amy were still barely out of being cubs, but every male was wary of going near them as their past was one I refused to speak of. Oliver was the ship's chef, and alongside his wife Kayla, they were the odd couple out. Oliver was one of us, a Vulpinian. Kayla was a Felinid. She was the only non-Vulpinian in the crew. Did we care? No, not even a little. She sat in her husband's lap as we waited for the harbor master to finally get tired of us and scrap our only remaining home. There was an 8th crew member, Lars, a grizzled veteran of war with a scarred right eye and a chip on his shoulder who was our security. But he was out in the dry dock trying to source some parts. Of course. It also didn't help that this was human space. Humans terrified most of the galaxy. After what happened with them and the Rakandi, nobody dared get in their way, not even most law enforcement would try stop them. I heard a short beat go off, one that wasn't of the angry variety. Proximity alarm. I looked at one of the few screens that still worked and noticed it was Lars with a human in tow. They both approached the airlock and began equalizing pressure so they could enter. It was a human, all right. But he wore a uniform I had never seen before. I got up from my seat and helped Lars unjam the airlock doors. Again. "Good day, Cap. I'm back. I miss anything?" I grunted as I pushed the door to its open position and moved aside to allow my guests to pass through. "Not really. Aside from more angry beeping, no." The human wandered in without a word. Being 2 feet shorter than the rest of us, I barely noticed he walked in. He wore a heavy robe made of polymers and beast leathers, dyed a scarlet red. His face covered by a gas mask of sorts, a cowl over his head, and carried with him a walking stick in the shape of an enormous sharpened wrench. Underneath it, I could very clearly see some heavy biomechanical augmentation, some cables and wires where there should never be cables and wires. He looked around for some time, then up at me. He bowed his head silently and walked over to the bridge. "Is this the harbor master?" "No. Apparently he is a mechanic of sorts. I told him about our ship's problems while I was browsing the mothballed parts yard and he offered to check it out," Lars replied as he double-checked the airlock was properly sealed. "Ah, we can't afford his consultation, you know. We're in dire straits as it is." I sighed, sorrowful, and followed him to the bridge. "What other choice do we have? What's that old human saying? Between a rock and a hard place?" "Don't remind me. If we miss this cargo delivery, we will face lawsuits and fines from the Jahanti Empire. If we go home, we'll be hanged. If we stay here, we will suffer the human bureaucracy." Both of us shuddered in fear at that last one. The human was on the bridge, silently looking around. Eerily quiet, he just stood in front of each component, occasionally extending a hand out and waving it about at whatever piece of machinery he was looking at. Once or twice, he took out a cable from the wearable computer on his left arm and plugged it into a console, then stood silent. This behavior continued for about an hour as he moved his way through the ship, finally approaching the reactor. Each time he encountered a new machine. Strange things seemed to happen. Screens previously thought broken or worthless, turned on displaying a strange code we had never seen before, suddenly came to life near his presence. The drinks machine we were never able to get working whirred to function and dispensed a drink in a can. Displays or boards that either gave us a lot of trouble or outright refused to work, even if they had been freshly replaced, suddenly came to life. A computer bank we had previously thought was just broken junked inexplicably whirred to life for a few minutes when he walked in the room. He typed on a few consoles, then waved a hand, shutting everything down. He looked at a specific part of a mechanical device, then reached in, pinpointing exactly the location of a misaligned gear wheel, putting it back into place. That machine instantly booted up and began working again. He encountered a switch we had previously confirmed linked to nothing. Upon turning it on, the ship's backup life support system suddenly booted up. We never knew it even had a backup life support system. I personally went through this ship a dozen times over the last 2 years. That switch never did anything, and I never found a backup life support system. We were getting nervous now. He had remained mostly silent. The only noises we could hear from him were his footsteps and the breathing from his gas mask, mixed in with a rare sound. As he approached the reactor, he went into a combat stance and brandished the wrench staff he was holding in a defensive posture, pointing the sharpened end at the reactor's fuel port. He fumbled about for a few seconds, then procured some kind of small, finger-sized containment vessel that was glowing a bright, sparkly blue. He inserted this device into a port on the underside of his wrench and stood there in front of the reactor as if he was facing down a demon. "In the name of the machine spirit, I command thee to cease thine heresy and return thyself to the fold of the Iron Lord," he suddenly yelled out. He then bashed the casing of the reactor 3 times. "Cease your heresy!" Each time the wrench impacted, the ship shuddered, and a wave of electrical energy of blue and purple emitted itself from the impact point. The ship went dark for 2 minutes. Then we all heard the reactor start up again. The bridge came back to life. The life support mechanism suddenly whirred back to function. Monitors, previously broken, suddenly returned to full functionality, and the airlock cycled itself. A starboard thruster that had never worked suddenly sputtered to life as a spark of gas burst out of it. Then it shuddered to full power. Shielding arrays that had only ever worked under duress burst to function as the ship was now bathed in a soft blue glow. Noise of machinery and computers suddenly powering back to life or restoring to function as though there had never been any problems saturated our hearing for the next 10 minutes. Ray and Jess were besides themselves with excitement as they began to scour readouts and started learning things about the ship that they never knew existed. Within the space of a few minutes, the ship started to work as though it had just been released from its parent dry dock. The human then returned to the bridge and silently looked around for a bit more. He then looked at his wrench staff and removed the device he put in it earlier. It was now glowing a dark purple, emitting a kind of energy that frankly scared me. He carefully placed it in a sealed container and put it on his belt holster. He waved his hand and the ship returned to a standby mode meant for dry dock or station operations. He took a more proactive approach this time and started typing on consoles and checking readouts. After a while, he seemed satisfied. The machine's spirit has been punished for its insolence and defiance. Its demands for appeasement have been met. However, please note of the following, he said, his voice a distorted biomechanical monstrosity as he handed me a data pad. I read them aloud to the crew. Starboard thruster needs to be replaced. Life support system backup needs a new O2 volumetric scrubber. Defensive turret requires barrel replacement and what the... I strained to consider the concept of the last item. Melody's call requests fuzzy dice? I looked at the human in pure confusion. He seemed to understand what was going through my head. Melody's call is the ship's soul name. All ships have a birth name and a soul name. The fact she told you this is proof she trusts you. She wants fuzzy dice. The human responded. He reached behind him and retrieved a box he was carrying on his back and rummaged around in it for a moment and retrieved a pair of fuzzy fabric-covered cubes attached to each other by a strong cord. He then hanged it in pride of place in the middle of the room from the ceiling. The ship seemed to respond to it, somehow. It let out a soft groan of metal as if it were letting out a sigh of relief. Then the ship's noise dampeners kicked in, and beyond some beeping and normal noise, there was silence. Walk always in the light of the void, he said, gave us a bow and walked out, the airlock opening, cycling and closing with no effort. Within 2 days, we had completed the delivery with nary a problem for the entire trip and had 6 months' worth of contract work as a result of it. The reactor seemed to gain more power faster, the shields slightly stronger and more flexible. The ship, after we replaced the parts on the list we were given, could suddenly pull of maneuvers that barely a month prior would have sheared it in half. Ray and Jess ended up putting a shrine of some kind, based on the emblem seen on the human's cloak in front of the reactor. Every week on Sunday, we would all gather in front of it, and Ray would use a socket wrench he bought and gently tap the reactor housing 3 times. The ship served us well for the next 30 years before it gave us any trouble.